Hello, and welcome to the detailed video on the critical lens of Marxism. There are four things that I'm going to talk about, and all of them will require unpacking. So I'm going to get straight into it. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the concepts contained within Marxism, particularly Marxism in relation to literary criticism and literary theory. So the concepts, as it applies to English, we are viewing the socio-economic class struggle. So that is uh, particularly a lower class, a working class that is being oppressed by a ruling class or a management class or a boss class. The second concept is the exploitation of labor, which is linked to this class struggle. We have that ruling class that is oppressing that working class uh, through various mechanisms. One of those mechanisms is by the overworking of that class, so they don't have the time, energy, means to organize a retaliation against that ruling class. And that idea of retaliation comes at the end here. The idea of uprising against masters, particularly as part of a union between groups or a group to retaliate against a minority of masters. Um, Something that this makes me immediately think of is The Greatest Showman is a really interesting example of this because it has a very clear other working class by the circus performers, or however they are described in that text, and the public strangely acts as the ruling class there, where we have this performing or working class that is forced into an identity that is purely of the work that they do, and they are deprived of anything further than that. And their small attempts to attain their own identity are really crushed by that ruling class. That text isn't completely Marxist. I would say that the conclusion is contrary to the idea of Marxism, but I'm not going to get stuck on that too much. I think that's a nice illustration of this idea. The language, the first part of the language is two French words, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And I'm saying that in a very Australian English way. Can say it with a French accent if you want, but that's going to communicate the meaning just fine, saying it in your own accent, essentially. The proletariat is the working class. There are connotations of it being hardworking. There's connotations of them maybe being uneducated against their will many times, but also being honest, being a community, those kinds of things. And the bourgeoisie is the ruling society. This carries connotations of aristocracy. It carries connotations of maybe being smug, over educated, of having excess money, excess wealth, being perhaps wasteful. Uh, and these are essentially two um, contrasting cultures. Even though they're from the same species, they are behave in utterly different ways. Another term that Marxism uses is value, and in this case, value is essentially money, and particularly when we're talking about labor, labor meaning work, and value here is meaning the bourgeoisie is taking value away from the proletariat. They deserve to have the um, full value of their work, but because the managers are managing them, they take a substantial cut from that work. Control is another term, probably not a complex term, but the bourgeoisie is controlling the proletariat. Capitalism, uh, we've finally arrived at that term. Marxism is often considered the opposite of capitalism. Capitalism is the idea that um, almost anything goes in terms of earning money. Um, Sometimes even to the point of a black market being considered like an optimal capitalist creation because it's a totally free market, totally unregulated by the government. The idea of Marxism is that the non-English, the pure sociology, the economic version of Marxism is about creating regulations to make sure we don't have these two distinct classes, making sure we have one class of people being equal. That's the idea of um, economic Marxism. So capitalism is essentially the opposite of this. And division of labor is the last one. It's the idea that it's unfair that this working class is spending their time working while the ruling class is spending their time enjoying all the benefits that technology and society and advancement has made. So, division of labor is another uh, phrase used within Marxism. The obvious seminal contributors to Marxism is Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. Um, Obviously, is named after Karl Marx, and if you're really interested in grammar, that means this term will always have the capital M because it's after someone's name. Uh, Antonio Gramsci is another really interesting contributor. Uh, um, has come from a very different context to Marx. Some would say that Marx himself is speaking outside of the perspective of the proletariat because of the funding he received from his colleague. Um, though I still think his ideas do apply well to current society. And uh, think it was Fred Jameson is the last seminal contributor, I would say. But he's a recent literary critic. His stuff is quite interesting, and it's also quite clear how the examples that he applies Marxism to. Um, I don't even think he calls all of his examples as Marxism. He probably talks more in terms of language and concepts, but the types of things that he argues about are Marxist ideas. And to tie this up, here's how I would articulate a Marxist thesis. Through adopting a Marxist lens, Blade Runner 2049 critiques proletarian oppression in late capitalist society. And you'll notice if you have watched my thesis video that some of the language used here isn't as technical as some of those theses. The reason why is because this is considered profound from the mere fact that it has a critical lens in the in the thesis. And I've also used the terminology of Marxism. Late capitalist is essentially capitalist, but there's a little bit of detail, and I'll leave you to research the difference between capitalist and late capitalist. Um, yes, this thesis doesn't need to have really complicated grammar. It doesn't need to have particularly complicated language, particularly because the language is almost ascribed to you by the critical lens. That's why critical lenses are so powerful because they provide you with these ideas, they provide you with the language. So you have your evaluation already prepared to go, essentially, and then you are going to inspect the text to find examples of this happening. Okay. I hope that's helpful, and I'm going to move on to the next critical lens. See you.